Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
That's me when I was in first grade. And in the middle is the first poem that I ever made up. Anybody in first grade?
We were kindergarten.
Kindergarten, okay. And what grade are you in?
What grade are you? Kindergarten.
Oh, kindergarten, okay, two kindergartners, okay. Two old men, okay. All right, kindergarten. All right, so that's the first poem that I ever made up. And I actually didn't write it down myself because I didn't know how to spell many words back then. So my mother, who heard the poem when I recited it, asked me if I'd say it again, and then she wrote it down after I said it the second time. My dad was a high school printing teacher, meaning he had printing presses in his classroom. Printing presses they have ink on them, and they're not like the printers that you have hooked up to your devices, to your computer, or to your iPad, or to your phone. You have to put ink on them, and they have rolls, drums, and paper comes out on the other end. They are electrical now, but these were printed on a letterpress in my dad's classroom. And it meant that I got to see my work in print before there were the digital devices that you take for granted. Like I said, there were no computers, cell phones, there were no tablets in homes or offices or schools. We had typewriters back then. Raise your hand if you've seen typewriter type before. Okay. So typewriter type doesn't look quite like the type that you see in newspapers, magazines, books, and on the web. The newsletter you see is published by my sixth grade class. My teacher was Mrs. Hayes, and I wrote an article about homework. That's a page from maybe my fifth grade spelling notebook. My handwriting's not that pretty anymore, but some of the words on the spelling list were hesitated, scenery, and famous. These were some of my favorite books as a girl. Raise your hand if you've read any of these books. See some that you read? Okay. And this is the first poem that I had published professionally, meaning by someone other than my dad in his printing class and somewhere other than a school publication. The poem was about jazz, and it was published in 1980, and after that was published, I started telling people that I was a poet, and I began to set my sights on being a published author. I didn't want to be a published author when I was growing up, when I was reading all these books, because I figured all the authors were dead. Certainly none of them looked like me, and I had no idea that authors got paid to write. So I eventually found that out. And in 1995, my first children's book, Juneteenth Jamboree, came out. It was about the first African-American holiday, Juneteenth, which stands for June 19th, 1865, the date in U.S. history when the last enslaved people were freed. Two of my favorite books that I've written are both young adult verse novels, Becoming Billie Holiday and Kin Rooted in Hope, which traces my family's history back to 1770 on a plantation in Maryland. I've had more than 80 books published, and those books have won a total of 18 American Library Association Youth Media Awards. These are some other awards that I've received, my books have received, or I have received as an individual. But not all awards are shiny stickers. Some are trophies, like the NAACP Image Award, the Arnold Adolph Poetry Award, which is on the right, and the Jane Addams Peace Association Award for Children's Literature, which back then was a doll. So I can have that doll in my collection of awards at home. The most important part of my writing process is rewriting or revision. And when I wrote about Ketanji Brown Jackson, I first wrote her picture book biography in paragraph form, but I later decided, maybe 2 weeks later, after 2 weeks after getting the contract to publish the first version, that I wanted to revise it and turn it into a poem. And so what you see on the right-hand side is my revision that is more poetic than the earlier draft. So the book that I'm going to share with you is How Do You Spell Unfair? MacNolia Cox and the National Spelling Bee. It's set in 1936 in Ohio and in Washington, D.C. At that time, segregation was the law in many places in the United States. Segregation separated people by skin color. by whether, usually back then it meant black people were separated from white people, but it also might mean in some regions of the country that indigenous or Native American people were separated from white people, or that Latino people were separated from white people. The laws were unjust, but they did exist at that time up until at least 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Well, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Segregation does persist to this day, however, still goes on. Some of the facilities that were where people were separated by race included bus station waiting rooms and ticket windows, railroad cars and coaches, restaurants and lunch counters, parks, swimming pools, lunch counters, restrooms, water fountains, movie theaters, circuses and carnivals. At a carnival, there might be what was called Negro Day. So on Negro Day, all the black people could come to the carnival. The rest of the days, let's say if a carnival stays in town for a week, the rest of the days were reserved for white people and their families. Even hospitals and cemeteries were segregated, and in some cases people died because they could not receive treatment they needed at a hospital emergency room because they were not white. I do quite a bit of research. I often write about historical subjects, and I do quite a bit of research. For MacNolia Cox and the National Spelling, this book about MacNolia Cox, I was able to use newspapers to do most of my research, because the spelling bee is, to this day, sponsored by newspapers across the country. So as you might imagine, newspapers told the story about the spelling bee in pretty much detail across the country, and each newspaper that sponsored a contestant would chronicle their contestant's participation in the spelling bee, both locally and nationally. So I'm going to read the book now, and there's some points when I ask if you can spell different things, and I will see if you can spell them, because the words are going to be on the screen. The book is illustrated by Frank Morrison, one of my favorite illustrators, and I've worked with him 5 or 6 different times. One of my latest books, Family Feast, is also illustrated by Frank Morrison. MacNolia Cox was no ordinary kid. Her idea of fun was reading the dictionary. From A to Z, she learned words' meanings and spellings. She loved to read, study, and spell. In 1936, the 8th grader won her school spelling bee. After MacNolia passed a 50-word written test in an oral competition, she advanced to the Beacon Journal newspaper's citywide bee. That April evening, MacNolia faced 50 of the city's best spellers. 3,000 people jammed the Armory in Akron, Ohio. Can you spell nervous? N-E-R-V-O-U-S. With butterflies in her stomach and a lump in her throat, MacNolia listened to pronunciations and definitions before spelling each word. MacNolia got ruled out. Teary-eyed, she got her coat and prepared to leave. But someone urged her to stay. Due to an error, the judges brought her back. MacNolia correctly spelled daft, writ, pretentious, brusque, abstemious, gradate, felicitate, and apoplexy. Can you even pronounce those words? In the final round of the bee, MacNolia battled back and forth with John Huddleston until he tripped up on the word sciatic. After spelling the word that John had missed, MacNolia had one more word to the title, voluble, V-O-L-U-B-L-E. With those 7 letters, MacNolia became the first African American to win the Akron Spelling Bee. Her prize was $25 and a trip to the National Spelling Bee in Washington, D.C. Can you spell surprised? S-U-R-P-R-I-S-E-D. At events all over Akron, MacNolia was the guest of honor. Backstage at the Palace Theater, the spelling dynamo met dancer and actor Bill Bojangles Robinson and jazz musician and composer Fats Waller. At the Akron City Club, she dined with local bigwigs. African American clubs held fundraisers, and black churches took up offerings to help with her travel costs. People also prayed for her. Akronites now mention MacNolia Cox in the same breath as boxing champion Joe Louis and the track star Jesse Owens. Can you spell famous? Letters and telegrams poured in from far and wide. MacNolia's school community was rooting for her too. Her teacher, Miss Grieve, bought her a new dress, and a man gave her a beautiful necklace. MacNolia also received 2 dictionaries to study. She spent 3 periods a day prepping for the National Bee. She memorized 100,000 words. Can you spell dedication? At Akron's Union Station, a military band and a crowd of thousands saw the spelling champ off to Washington. For her first train ride, MacNolia got on board with her mother, Miss Grieve, and Mabel Norris, a reporter from the Beacon Journal, the newspaper that sponsored the Akron Bee. "This is the most fun I've ever had," said MacNolia. "Can you spell excited?" But she was about to face some hard truths. Can you spell discrimination? Do you even know what it means? MacNolia would soon find out firsthand. On the train, MacNolia sat in a coach open to black and white passengers. But when the train reached the Maryland state line, she and her mother were forced to move to the blacks-only car. Back then, segregation was the law in the South. When MacNolia arrived in Washington, she and her mother had to stay with a black doctor because the hotel where the other spellers stayed was for white customers only. MacNolia and her mother couldn't even ride the main elevator at the Spelling Bee banquet. They had to climb the stairs. Inside the banquet hall, they were seated away from other spellers and their families. She and Elizabeth Kinney from Plainfield, New Jersey, were the first African Americans students to compete at the National Spelling Bee since 9 newspapers founded the competition in 1925. The 2 black girls had to enter the ballroom through a back door and were seated at a card table apart from the other spellers. Can you spell racism? Though second-class treatment met her at every turn, MacNolia couldn't afford to get rattled. She had to concentrate and to believe in herself. She remained calm and nailed word after word. Can you spell focus? F-O-C-U-S. The judges threw harder and harder words at the spellers. In the audience, Miss Grieve, MacNolia's teacher, bit her lip. One by one, the competition fell. Elizabeth Kinney misspelled appellation and placed 10th. When Doris Rubin misspelled acceptability, MacNolia advanced to the final 5. The judges, mostly from the segregated South, couldn't seem to stump her. Then they threw a curveball, a word that MacNolia hadn't studied, nemesis. N-E-M-A-S-I-S, she answered. MacNolia's teacher and the newspaper reporter protested. They argued that the word nemesis was not on the official list. Furthermore, in MacNolia's dictionary, the word was a proper noun, referring to a Greek goddess, and thus not acceptable. The judges stood by their decision. Can you spell unfair? U-N-F-A-I-R. MacNolia was out. But what an achievement. She had made history by becoming a finalist in the National Spelling Bee. The spellers spent the rest of the week sightseeing. They visited the White House and the Washington Monument. MacNolia saw stamps being printed at the Bureau of Engraving. Can you spell amazed? A-M-A-Z-E-D. At the end of the whirlwind trip, MacNolia took home a $75 prize and was honored with a big homecoming parade. Can you spell proud? P-R-O-U-D. Even though she didn't win the championship, MacNolia had proven that African American students are as smart as anyone and can compete and excel when given a level playing field. That was MacNolia's triumph. That's MacNolia Cox. And how do you spell unfair? In 2021, 14-year-old Zaila Avant-Garde became the first African American to win the Scripps National Spelling Bee. The winning word was Mariah, the name for a genus of tropical trees. That same year, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution honoring MacNolia Cox's life, legacy, and achievements. So that's the picture book biography, MacNolia Cox. Well, how do you spell unfair? MacNolia Cox and the National Spelling Bee. And yes, it is a true story. It is the partial biography, meaning it only tells a portion of Magnolia's life story, not her entire life story, just the chapter of her story that took place in 1936 with her spelling accomplishments. So I'll take some questions now, if you have any. No questions? What's the biggest word you can spell? What's the longest word you can spell?
Which one you can spell? Been working on his last name.
Okay. Okay. What's your last name? You can tell me.
Oh. You're feeling a little nervous?
Okay.
Williams.
Williams? Okay. My boyfriend's name is William, not with the S though. That's a pretty long name. But guess what my last name is? It's even longer. Weatherford.
Ooh.
Weatherford, yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty long name. I usually, when I say like the weather outside in the Ford car, so I don't have to spell it for people.
I'm curious, have you ever looked her up to see?
What happened?
Yeah.
Oh, I know what happened.
Yes.
She received a college scholarship, but it wasn't quite enough to cover the expenses, so she didn't go to college, and I think she became a custodian for a dentist. Yeah, so she did not, this was kind of the pinnacle for her. This is the high point, one of her greatest accomplishments. I don't think she had children. Having children, that's my greatest accomplishment. But yeah, she didn't have children, and she didn't fulfill the promise that the spelling bee might have foretold. But she faced a lot of obstacles during her time because she was African American, and the laws were not on her side. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you feel about, like, have you written, I know you have written a couple of biographies. They've all been partial biographies, or have you written any full?
Yeah, I've written full biographies. But they're all picture books, though, so they tend to be, they're still going to be 32, 40, 48, or 56 pages.
Did you find, I guess in that respect, do you have a preference on telling somebody's whole story, or?
No.
Getting to,
I don't have a preference. I told the biography that I showed you of Ketanji Brown Jackson told her whole story up to the point when she was nominated to the Supreme Court. So no, I don't have a preference. Usually the biographies are full biographies. One of my first books is considered historical fiction, but it's actually my breakthrough book. Moses, When Harriet Tubman Led Her People to Freedom, is a partial biography of Harriet Tubman. But it only chronicles her first escape and the reckoning that she had with God about going back to help free other people, mainly family members. But it's considered historical fiction because the story unfolds in three voices: Harriet's voice, God's voice, and the narrator's voice. And of course I had, some of the things that Harriet said I knew, but I had to invent God's voice. And I say lightning has not struck, so I guess it was okay. Yes?
What's the next book you're going to be working on?
I'm working on a hip-hop novel with my son, and it's set in Baltimore. It'll be a verse novel for middle grade and young adult. And I've had a few books come out this fall. One is Family Feast. That's illustrated by Frank Morris, and that's not in this. None of my new books are in the presentation. Grind, which is about skateboarding. It's an ode to skateboarding. Do you skateboard? You do? You need to get Grind. Man, you got to get on the grind. It's got some cool illustrations too. I guess he's like a graffiti artist or street artist from Argentina, and he goes by the name of Anguria, or Angurier, like angrier, but it's, yeah. Yeah, but it's called Grind, and it's got really cool illustrations. When I Move also came out this year. It's for really young kids, just about moving your body and how you can use this. It's very metaphorical. So when I swim, I become a fish. When I leap, I become a wish. That kind of thing. It's going to eventually be a board book. And then I've had three other books this year. Oh, Wrap It Up, which is, do you rap? You don't rap? Okay, not yet. Okay. Wrap It Up is about how to write and perform your own raps. So, and that was co-authored with my son and illustrated by a mural artist from Philadelphia named Ernell Martinez. And then there are two books that I'm missing. I don't know what they are. Yeah. And I've got a few books coming out next year as well.
Hi, so thank you for telling us about all your work. I'm so sorry I was a little bit late, so I hope I don't ask anything that was already stated.
Oh no, don't worry about it.
Okay. I guess I wanted to ask, like, with how literacy seems to be changing, or maybe how people relate to books, or other kind of media is changing for young people, do you, like, with all of your producing work and making art and making these meaningful stories and telling stories, do you have any, like, information or advice for families now that are trying to
About how to keep kids reading?
Yeah.
Well, if you can, bring your kids to the library because it's free and they get to choose their own books and follow their lead. For example, my son, when he was growing up, he liked to get books about sharks and magic. And he knew exactly where those books were on the library shelves, and he would go directly to that section and borrow books. When he got in middle school, he didn't want to go to the library with me anymore, although his older sister continued to go with me. But I'd always borrow a stack of books for him, about a dozen books, and I'd sit them in his bedroom, and he'd read at least two of them. So you just have to keep it in front of them. It's kind of like food. If they don't like one food, you try another, and you just keep feeding them. You just have to keep feeding them. And let them see you reading. That's very important because you've got to model the behavior as well. Read with them even after they can read to themselves. Read together. So that's important. And if you can do activities that are connected with the books, that's great. Not everybody is that inventive or has time for that. And if you don't have time to read a book, read a poem. That's what I used to do when my husband would be. He was in school and had a lot of community meetings, and he was a pastor as well as a letter carrier, and he was just out most evenings. And he would read books to them, but I was more likely to read a poem because by the time I got them, fed and homework and, pajamas, I was tired. I didn't have time to read a book. I'm like, let's do a poem. And they never felt cheated, and eventually they'd memorize the poem because sometimes we'd read the same poem over and over again. So yeah, do that. And find opportunities that present the literature in other formats, like this author visit, and if there's a movie tie-in, do that, or if there's a play. But the library is a great resource. Fantastic resource.
I have a question. Do you feel, more inspired now with the book bans that's going on to continue to write? And, for us, Jane Addams, you've written many books that have won our award because they focus on issues like social injustice.
Yeah, well, my mission as an author is to mine the past for family stories, fading traditions, and forgotten struggles. And I've extended it to that center African American resistance, resilience, remarkability, rejoicing, and remembrance. And so that cuts a pretty wide swath. I got a lot of leeway. But I have interests beyond African American history as well. So I've got a book coming out next year about jellyfish. It has nothing to do with with race or social justice. It's called 14 Ways of Looking at Jellyfish. I don't feel any more, any less committed because I've always been committed. This is the work that I've chosen to do, to focus on social justice issues and to lift up African American history and culture. So I'm continuing to do that, not because of the book bans. It might be more difficult to get some of that content published now. I've been told that the picture book market in general is kind of soft at the moment. And tariffs haven't helped because most picture books are printed overseas. It's too expensive to get them done here. They come over they either come from Latin America or on slow boats from China. So that hasn't helped the picture book market at all. And with book bans in many states, schools can't include books that they think are diverse or that are inclusive. They don't want to include those books. So it's an uphill battle right now. But I'm just continuing to do what I do and hoping that the content can find a place either in books or maybe to be presented in public. I started out just going to poetry readings, reading at open mics when I was in my 20s. I was inspired by poets of the Black arts movement, like Nikki Giovanni and Hakeem Abudi. So, I think poetry will find a way. Like in Jurassic Park, they said life finds a way, poetry finds a way, literature finds a way. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you decide or choose, if you do, on who is the illustrator that you're going to work with?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. The answer to that question has changed depending on what stage I was in my career. At the beginning, the publishers just chose illustrators for me. You're going to work. We're going to pick Kadir Nelson to illustrate Moses. You're going to be working with this unknown person you've never met and never will meet for this book. When I got a little clout in the industry, the editor might say, "Do you have an illustrator in mind?" And then I could submit a wish list, and then they might check with the illustrators and say, "Well, this illustrator is booked through 2029," and I'm like, "Well, I don't want to wait half my life to get the book published." And this illustrator has already done a book on a similar subject, or is going to be, and so we can't use that illustrator. And then the publisher suggests alternatives. Sometimes they're illustrators who are at the same stage in their career that I am, and they tend to be the ones who are busiest, booked farthest in advance. Other times the illustrators may be a new talent. So A Song for the Unsung was a new talent. I think that was his first book, Brian McCrae. So just and I should mention that I like to work with my son, so I try to create vehicles where I can work with him. So Kin Rooted in Hope was illustrated by my son Jeffrey, as was this illustration on this page is from You Can Fly, the Tuskegee Airmen, which was our first collaboration. So I'd love to work with my son and help him along when I can. We also present together. But I've been working with a lot of illustrators recently whom I've never met, and some live overseas. I think one lives in, I don't know, this Madagascar or somewhere. I don't know. Yeah. So we may never meet. Her name's Sawyer Cloud. And she's illustrated, I think, 4 of my books. I'm doing board books again now too. I started out doing board books, and I've returned to that. My kids were little when I started out, and now I've got grandkids, so I'm doing board books again.
How many manuscripts have you written?
Oh gosh.
How many publications?
published?
Oh, gosh. I'm sure I've written well over 100 manuscripts. Not all of them have been published. Some are still on the laptop, still on the hard drive, still in the cloud, or still in the file cabinet. And probably will never be published. We'll never say never, huh? Any other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.